Hello, hello! I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write, where I give questionable writing advice through running metaphors. I love fantasy stories, but there are tropes across the genre which bring down the novels they're a part of. Tropes are easy to write and include within our stories, but they're often a crutch we don't need. I'm guilty of writing tropes, my favorite authors are guilty of it too, and there's even a website called tvtropes.org which tracks, categorizes, and arguably makes fun of the common occurrences within these various shows. Today I'll highlight 5 bad fantasy tropes from novels I've read, and I'll discuss how they can be avoided when we go about writing our own stories. Number 1. Chosen One. Nothing is less interesting than having a character be born into power, or having the universe align to give them some MacGuffin. Worse, when a fantasy character on a farm learns that they have some innate power, it usually means that they're a long lost or hidden away royal child. Look at people in our world. The most brilliant person on the planet isn't a monolith far superior to everyone else. They still have peers who build off that genius's work, and likewise that genius developed their intelligence based on the works of others. The fastest sprinters on the planet are obviously much faster than I could ever hope to be, but they are only fractions of a second faster than each other. To have a chosen one whose magic or intelligence overshadows everyone else leads to a boring hero story. Another way of thinking about this is with Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Sherlock Holmes is brilliant, but he'd be lost and needs to be balanced out by Watson. In many incarnations, Sherlock Holmes is merely brilliant and Watson is the brawn to protect Holmes. I think the worst versions of Sherlock Holmes are when he's both a brawler and the smartest person in the room. So individually utilize your fighter, your mage, your thief. Make it so that each of them can shine and none of them is a chosen one. When the chosen one fighter is able to deduce the big bad's plan, outwit them in the end, defeat them in single combat, and a dozen other things along the journey, then I start to wonder why they needed to be on a team in the first place. This will make me think of the other characters as leeches, which means I won't like them. I have a hot take here and will likely be debated, but do not write a chosen one story. Have a character naturally become a hero based on the choices they make and their devotion to a craft, rather than a destiny placed on their shoulders. Full disclosure, this is a little hypocritical of me to say, as I have a slight chosen one story within my work in progress. Except I break the trope by having the main character be explicitly told that there were better alternatives. In essence, the main character was chosen out of desperation, and one of the first things they did with their power was share it, thus creating a chain of multiple chosen ones. Number 2, immortal heroes. Be it plot armor or simplified storytelling, a week of training is not enough to make a person proficient in a skill. I have a lot of problems with stories where enemies have overtaken the walls and the heroes are fighting in close quarters against warriors who are stronger and more experienced than them. Yet the heroes are somehow holding their own. There is a common loophole where the enemies may be trying to capture the heroes alive, so we send wave after wave of bodies against them until they succeed. I think after the first dozen grunts get killed though, that they would stop trying to subdue the heroes and would instead go for those kill shots. One idea to break this trope is to make the hero fail. Perhaps the hero could pull in all their magic to try and save everyone and then nothing happens. Having attempted to gather that much power causes them to collapse in exhaustion where they're then mistaken for a dead body. How that fallen hero acts in the aftermath of battle would lead to interesting and unique stories. Number 3, badass is not badass. This is a follow-up to my previous point about how a day or week-long training session grants the heroes the ability to overcome their enemies. The hero's mentor or side character has devoted their entire life to a cause, and up until this point they have been an absolute badass. They have slayed hordes, outwitted the villain, and trained the hero. Now in the climax of the story with only minimal sparring, the main character defeats the villain where the badass could not. In its worst form, this comes off as appropriation as the main character becomes a better archer, wizard, tracker, or modern day equivalent skill to the people who are known for those skills. This can also be overtly sexist when the badass woman who's been saving the quote-unquote hero the entire novel then needs to be saved by the person who discovered their power last week. I understand the importance of making the main character go on a journey, and that the person guiding them along is often a badass. Why not have a final fight where the main character gets their showdown with the villain, but the badass is holding off the entire army so they can get that 1v1 fight? Use the side character's badassery as the reason they won't participate and allow the main character to grow as an individual. Or make it a team effort. This isn't as common in more Western storytelling where a single hero or a small group of heroes tend to shine. However, I'm a fan of teams, and I will include my badass working with the quote-unquote main characters as they overcome an enemy together. For example, you could have a badass character fighting side by side with the less experienced main character and stepping in to defend them when they need it. That will be exceptionally difficult to do because the badass would need to hold their own in a fight and also pay attention to what's going on around them. Another idea may be to have the badass intentionally avoid the fight so that they can gauge the main character's strength. There are a lot of ways to nullify or hold a specific character in reserve. Maybe in our stories we refrain from having the badass character act as nothing more than a stepping stone to show how powerful the main character has gotten in an unreasonably short amount of time. Number 4, uniformity. Be it race, species, culture, whatever. When every member of a group acts the same way, I'm kicked out of the story and remember that all I'm doing is reading words on a page. All dark elves are evil and they do evil to do evil, whereas all light elves are good and pure. Nah. As much as I love Raymond Feist's fantasy series about Mechemia, there was an entire novel to explain how a free-thinking dark elf left their society, fought alongside humans, and was rewarded by becoming a light elf, at which point they were considered to be good and redeemed. That was an interesting story, but it would have been much better if that dark elf weren't an anomaly, and if every dark elf weren't considered inherently evil. That does get fixed in later stories though. Take the time to show dissension with warring factions vying for power, and have people demonstrate their selfish ambitions and wants and needs. Going back to Mechemia, the main characters meet demons who are individuals, even as their entire society is obsessed with chaos and death. These demons all differed wildly and outright disrespected the demons the main characters had met earlier in the series. Some of the demons were conniving, others were physically strong, and still others were incredibly adept at magic. These differences made them all stand out, even as the entire society as a whole was a bloodthirsty race built upon murder and mayhem. By making the demons behave in a way which clearly served their own selfish interests, I was able to understand them much better and still loathe plenty of other demons they met along the way. Better than that, I started to understand the demons' motivations in a way which allowed me to predict where and how they would betray each other. Rather than make the story boring, it made it feel more real. And lastly, number 5, medieval Europe. Medieval Europe takes up such a small time period in history, yet it has such a monumental impact on fantasy settings. Can we as writers retire using the vague, often inaccurate, cookie-cutter European world from 1200 to 1500 as a backdrop for our fantasy stories? I promise to do so. Show me a fantasy story based on Central American Aztecs. Or if you really want to stick with the 1200s to 1500s, then base a fantasy realm on the Mali Empire. Please see my note on uniformity and be sure to do plenty of research so you aren't misrepresenting the culture. I think using a seemingly new culture as a basis for a fantasy world would lead to something that stands out from the regular fantasy novels on my TBR list. Also, I'll be closing this out with an honorable mention of a bad trope, which is the prophecy. I don't like them. I'll be coming out with a full rant video sometime in the near future, but suffice to say that in a lot of fantasy stories, there is no plot, there is only a prophecy. What I mean is that the characters have no reason to act in a certain way or to go on their quest, short of the fact that they're told to do so with the most basic guidance and handwavium, and that the prophecy itself is largely meant to entice the reader with a hint of mystery. Those are 5 overused fantasy tropes and ways to go about avoiding them in the works we write. I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write. If you enjoyed my trope fixes, then please press those like and subscribe buttons. Let me know in the comments what fantasy tropes make you put down a book. Do you agree with my opinions, or is everything I said wrong? I post my running and writing progress on Instagram and Twitter as Running to Write, so be sure to follow me and join in with your own thoughts. See you next time. Until then, break out of those fantasy trope molds.